Hello, hello, everyone. If you are joining us, welcome to our session. I'm going to go ahead and get our screen pulled up for gaining deeper insights. All right, so if you are joining our session, welcome. I will be running this main session today with Constance Miller, which if you haven't had the joy of working with Constance, she is a true data guru. I lean on her constantly to help me analyze some data. So we're going to talk through the trends today and talk through number one, what we're seeing through 2020, and then number two, some tools that we have available for you. So just want to make sure, Constance, can you hear me? Are we all set?
Yes, we're good. Good morning.
Good morning. So before we hop into some of the trends, this may be something that you all have been following along through the past year. I hope you have been following along. Each month, our team has been publishing an Insights and Impact Review report where we look at the trends for that month and compare it to how we are doing last year. We look at membership, at revenue, at check-ins, at program and childcare registrations. And we are hoping to just provide not only at a holistic, what is the recovery of the movement looking like, but also a deeper dig in by revenue size, because a smaller YMCA might be different than a larger YMCA or JCC and how they're recovering. But what we're looking at today is an even broader view, because we're nearing towards the end of the year. So we're looking at how a lot of these trends are looking at over the year as a whole. And then I'm just going to give a little plug. A lot of the data we're talking about is through October, because it's December 2nd. So we can't pull the data for November until November's done. So the November report will be published next week. So be on the lookout on the 15th. I believe that's next week. On the 15th of the month is when we publish them. So all the things we'll be talking to today, we'll have even more insight in the next coming days. So with that, we'll kick off with some gross revenue here. I think this graph is pretty interesting, and I'm going to kick it off over to Constance to talk through. Number one, what do we talk about when we say gross revenue? And then number two, what are your takeaways from this graph?
Yes, so it is always good to start with revenue, and thank you for that overview, Christy, because I think whenever we talk trends on the year, there's so many questions, and we're going to try and get to as many as possible in terms of what Christy was speaking to. And really, I'd like to lead when we talk with trends about the headline, right? So there's two important things for probably the rest of our conversation today, and then to answer your revenue question, Christy, and one is compared to what? So if we've had a data discussion before, and hopefully you've had this on your end as well. I know I'm speaking to a many experts in your own work on this call. It is valuable. Data is valuable, but it's most valuable when it is put in the right context. And I think we all know this to be true, but the right context for this year is really time, very much time. It's always time when we look at our key performance indicators, whichever one it is, that's an important metric. Seasonality, as we know with Ys and Js, is always incredibly important to know how we're doing, to see, if we're meeting or exceeding goals. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. I'm probably everyone on this call, in that revenue in particular, the time factor. So month to month, year over year, for really what has happened in the early months throughout the rest of this year is just vital. And we will keep coming back to that. That will be a consistent theme, not surprisingly, which is actually helpful when it comes to data. Certainly we like to test the trends that we see, but very much confirm what we know to be true by also living it. So with that said, to answer your question on what is gross revenue. So the second piece, and you're absolutely right, thank you for leading with this, Christy, is defining these terms so that they're understandable and keeping them really crisp and simple. Because the other contextual piece of compared to what is, I know every organization, every Y and J that we work with operations, splices and dices, takes the totals and then groups them together a little differently. I cannot tell you how many calls I have been on where the first request is, hey, can you kick out X real quick? you probably heard me say this before, but spoiler, silver sneakers is the most common one on that. When we are segmenting data, not only by time, but can we group that together to be meaningful? So to level set, gross revenue is the upfront addition of, and we should say credit, if we're getting technical for our accounting folks, I love accounting, in the front end of operations. So if it is entered into Daxko operations as a credit during a window of time, in this case months, is going to count as gross revenue. Now we know that there's several different ways to operate a business, to do your accounting. We are very fortunate that we're able to surface trends. We know that's very important right now because so much of that lives in operations. We also know that depending on your organization, you have that same information in a couple different places. So one thing I would like to call out as we move along, and then I promise I'll pick up on pace on the slides, is that you may or may not be logging additional gross revenue somewhere else. So a very common example would be we have some users who include all of their pledges in operations, and some of them do not if you have pledge revenue. But for the purposes of today, gross revenue is if you logged something in the front end as we got that in operations. So now to start talking trends, now we've got that housekeeping stuff taken care of. Moving forward, I think this one, oh my goodness. So we can see this speaks for itself. We all know around the middle of March where we found ourselves. I think the biggest takeaway from this view of revenue is that despite the seasonal disruption that we had up front in the beginning of the year and unprecedented throughout the season, once we got to July and beyond, you'll actually see that even though it is overall lower, that is to be expected. This year is flat out lower than last year. To what degree it is depends on where you're sitting. But the curve, the seasonality returned. If you can see kind of in July on moving forward, when we break this out by revenue size, you're going to really get some evidence around why this is and where it is showing up in that case. But I think this was one question that we had going into the year, which was, we know there's going to be a big impact. That, Q2, so to speak, on the screen is, we all felt that, but when is seasonality going to return? So there's really two questions. Like when are we back to normal? When are we where we were before? That's one. And the second one though is, when does the data start moving like it used to? When does our income streams or revenue streams start going up at a certain time and going down when we're used to them? And you could see that signal in the around what would typically be, of course, the end of the summer, start of the school year for a lot of programming and revenue. So there's more to say. I know we have a lot more to get to, Christy, but I'll pause there.
No, I think that's such a fair point. I actually love this graph because when I first started really working in trends, it was at the start of the pandemic, and we were always comparing to the start of the pandemic. And that wasn't wrong. Like, we totally should have and could have, but they got to a point where like there might be a month that it dips, and that like felt discouraging because we're in this pandemic and we're like, oh, it's 2020, it's dipping. But in reality, if you look at this graph, it naturally dips. That's what the seasonality of it. So yep. I think this is like, this helps kind of encourage that member trends we're stabilizing, though lower, it is stabilizing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the crude analogy to your exact point, which is right to call out, is that in the beginning it was so important. And as you mentioned, it was the right thing to keep a score of the game, so to speak. Like, where are we in how we are from a game to game, if we're using a sports analogy standpoint. But what you just said is moving from how did that score end up on that one football game or one basketball game to the whole season, the record of the season, for lack of a better way to put it. But I think that's exactly where the conversation is moving, and the data is moving there too.
Definitely. Let's dig into October. So we have this breakout here by revenue source, which is the trends are different than what it was in September.
That's right.
As far as who is the leader, what are some major takeaways here that you see?
Yeah, so as we walk through this, the outliers will continue to jump out, both on a high end of a percentage and a low end of the percentage. So I think anyone looking at this would be able to quickly see that depending on size, we've got some back to normal, so to speak. So like, what does a normal October look like? In this case, largely compared to last year. And then our largest Daxko operations users having the quote unquote like biggest impact of this for this month. And one of the things I think this says to me is that we need to go look at some more things, which are in the next slides. So why is this? I think when we look at any given month for what's impacting gross revenue, it's going to be a mix of where the revenue is coming from. So we all kind of know this. We get revenue from pledges, revenue from memberships, revenue from registrations, donations, whatever your mix is. And so we're going to look at that in a moment, which I think is very important to answer your question. The second thing I will say that will continue to be a trend is that our largest organizations, and I'm going to say something that again, I know we've got folks who are living this day to day. The larger organization that you work for, the more urban or suburban area you tend to be in, largely that is almost always the case. And because of that, and because of the overall, societal trends of the year, there have been great demands, needs in those communities, for but just the sheer number of, if we're talking about active memberships, maybe a greater number of holds, a greater number of terminations, potentially, depending on where you are, the more first responder programming, which may be offered at no cost, all things that, depending on the mix of how it has impacted those higher, more densely populated areas, which again tend to be where these larger organizations are, how that has really looked for their organizations versus folks who may be in more largely focused in a suburban area or largely focused in a mix of populations.
I think I would love to dig into your point of the composition, because that has been shifting each month.
Yes.
I remember, I think it was August, childcare just was such a leader in revenue source of the composition, which made sense because people were coming back to school. But I wanted to talk through this page as well, and how that really it influences the trends from the last page.
Yeah, so absolutely correct. And this is why I would say it begs the question of where's that revenue coming from? And this is why, to your point, it's so important to look at it. So keep in mind, when we're speaking revenue, this does not equate to registrations. So you can have $0 memberships right now, right? You can have $0 childcare right now. Other programming. And so this is really, if you are above that threshold, if there's $1 or more coming in for whatever that membership or that program may be, which really I can say from digging into the data a bit, is absolutely at play here. Those larger organizations have as you can see, a different mix have the highest mix of active membership revenue versus other revenue streams. So that dollar amount is going to be different, how much that equates to. But if you look at percentage wise, like if this was your revenue portfolio and where all your income is coming from, that is absolutely continues to be the case, that it is membership heavy revenue, which tends to be why, when we look at the information that was on the previous slide, if those members go on hold, or if they're heavily discounted right now, or if they have been, or if fees are being waived, all of those things you can see moving in the data the larger the organization is.
Yeah. Let's talk about check-ins, because this graph, I like the next graph better, but I felt like we need to show this as well. This one does show you what happened in April, but again, a very similar trending line once you start recovering. So it's an interesting graph to keep in mind.
It is. And the other thing to call out is that some of these are virtual. So to the point of what is revenue, what is a check-in? Now, we've been having such great conversations with so many Ys and Js around, is that what counts as a check-in? We know that we have some fantastic examples of virtual check-ins happening when there's virtual programming, or things like speaking of Silver Sneakers, like checking in Silver Sneakers members if they're engaging in the Y in another way, or maybe even through social media, we've seen some check-ins and with activity that way. And that really affected the summer in particular. So I think what's going to be interesting, to your point of seasonality, is we all know the headlines that we have in terms of COVID-19 right now. And depending on where you are and how that is affecting open status, how that is affecting safety measures, and what choices are being made from virtual check-ins versus in-person check-ins, that story will play out. We're watching that now. It will be interesting, like you said, when we have the November data available and out there in a week, if we see that seasonality continuing, if we see that, like, hey, in August, September, and October, there's some normalcy of the line in terms of where it's moving, or to what extent that changes again.
Yeah, and I think with everything that is happening right now and recognizing that it is getting worse over the next couple of weeks, that could impact what our trending line is, and it could impact what January looks like, and very well might. But positive signs of vaccines, so hopefully that is a short-lived dip if there is one. So this is the graph that I was referencing that I like and I prefer. I think that this.
I like this one too.
I think this just tells a very interesting story, not only because it shows positive signs of check-ins, whether that be virtual or in the facility, but that 0 to 3 million, it just always blows my mind. If you've been following along the last few months, we've been showing this pretty consistently. So I wanted to open it up, Constance. What are your favorite things about this graph?
My favorite thing about this graph is the consistency of the curves, and that sounds like a stats 101 thing to say, but sincerely, if you look at post May, there is a, to use a statistical term, there is kind of a normalized behavior at each group of organization. And in the year that we've had, that might not have necessarily been the case. So the fact that we see that our highest number of check-ins, and keep in mind, this is not taking into account membership size. These are straight up, and that was a choice. So it's not taking into account how big the organization is other than revenue. What this means is that we have our highest activity, and by activity, again, this can be virtual, it can be in person, at our largest organizations and at our smallest organizations. And what is fascinating is how consistent that's been, which is what I mean by the consistency of the curve, right? Like that was not a one-off of the year, that became a trend of the year. And I think that the really other thing to call out is that we're starting to see that the biggest ones, so that biggest organization at the top, if you were to look at this and kind of zoom in, it is starting to grow more than the other lines are, which we haven't talked about in the past, but it's starting to inch up a bit. So when we think back into what does that mean for revenue, we have really two different stories here, one of activity and one of revenue, and they don't necessarily go hand in hand with that particular organization. Now, the other one, which is not to be, we should mention this every time when we do, look at those smaller organizations having that higher touch point, particularly than normal. If you want to say, hey, what does this look like on a normal path? You can see it in the beginning of the year. It's moving together with the other organizations. So we have these outliers of very large memberships, very large communities, and then we kind of have other activity really moving together from size of organization, and it just obviously split post COVID. And I think we talked about this last month, and it bears repeating. So much of why we're seeing this is because in the large organizations, in the urban areas and suburban areas, there is this just wonderful, and I can't overstate, role of meeting community need in all the ways that Y's and J's and our partners do that. And that is mirrored in a different way in smaller communities where that work is happening across the board. It doesn't matter how big, but when you are for instance, a very large nonprofit in your area, and also when you may be one of the only ones in your area, which is what we're really seeing in some of those other smaller organizations. Now, before we move on, the one other thing I will say is that another reason why this can be happening, and I think we have some anecdotal evidence to this, is the smaller the organization, they have some evidence of having fewer closures in addition to what I just said. So it's really a combination that the data is showing of those two trends in action.
Yeah. Let's dig in a little bit deeper now to active memberships. So we've looked at
Mhm.
revenue, we've looked at check-ins. Active memberships for October were 77% back to normal, which, as you can see by the trending, that's been pretty consistent. We've stayed in the 78 to 77 range for the last couple of months.
Very consistent.
What are some major takeaways here?
Holds, and holds. And also the other piece is, I know it's no good to flip between slides, but if we keep that 80% revenue in our mind, what has also been interesting is that while these are not one-to-one, we saw there were different revenue sources, they are moving somewhat together as well. Percent back to normal in terms of active members and percent back to normal for revenue, because it tends to be the biggest revenue line for all organizations. So there is that. Again, that's an obvious statement, but a good one to remind. From the where this is settled, that is the headline. Exactly what you just said. This is settled in a range, and it is very much affected as on a month-to-month basis. So where we see differences to this, either like much less or much more, is when there has been I should say, I'm trying to think of the right word, where there have been some very active hold decisions.
Yeah.
Meaning moving members from an active status to a hold status, sometimes to avoid billing, sometimes forever, sometimes to avoid termination. By forever, I mean putting on and stayed on versus flipping back and forth. And so all of that, depending on the choices that your organization or your association has made around, hey, around billing time, we're just going to flip constants to hold again. To avoid that, we want to keep her, or maybe we did that for a couple months, versus moving back and forth between those two statuses. And so we really see that level out every month. If you looked at this day to day, this moves more, so the story of holds is that if you look at this day to day, and you can kind of see this in the national data and other views that we have, you'll see some more bouncing. And that's why. But when you stop and you say, okay, how did we end up in October? How did we end up in September? What's interesting is that it doesn't seem, when we've done some deeper analysis on this, there isn't actually a statistical difference that we can tell yet in terms of terminations or total back to normal based on that hold activity. It actually ends up netting out, so to speak, very similarly. So some organizations have different philosophies around that, everything I just said. And at the end of the day, though, it is averaging on the whole, resulting in a very similar result. Whether they're doing lots of holds or not, we just see them happening.
Yeah, holds have been such a name of the game when it comes to this year. And we'll see that in a couple of slides, that they're just so drastically up compared each month compared to last year. I wanted to take some time and dig into some major factors here. So we have new joins and we have terminations. And while the other slides have been trending, these feel all over the place. So wanted to talk through these major ones because they do impact that active membership along with the holds.
They do. And you're right, they are all over the place. And I think what is interesting is that they are both delayed this year because of holds. And by delayed, I mean, having worked with Y Data, and for those of you who I've been working with Y Data for, I want to say 12 years now, holds have been always around, but they haven't influenced terminations as much as they are now. So for instance, like been used as a strategy to avoid termination or delay a termination. So, and the same thing, as you can tell, so the side-by-side stories of these, the new joins really follows when you see a trend around opening closures. That makes total sense. When you see kind of movement in other trend lines around usage, and when virtual offerings are starting to be available. And then also a third thing I would say around new joins is that we are starting to see toward the end of the year, and you can see this uptick, two things that were spoken to yesterday, which is a different concept of membership, which can be a join. So that's going to be really interesting to watch. Types of virtual memberships, like philanthropic memberships, like the impact membership that was mentioned in the session by Greater Houston yesterday. Other concept of what can I join as, have been changing over the past several months. Again, everyone on this call is going to know that better than you and I, but depending on how that shifted, that is really affecting new joins. And then there's a societal trend of, I want to re-engage with something. If I've disengaged from it, can I, even if it's virtually, get some sense of something I used to do in my life back in it? And so I may be coming back to something if I can. And then the other piece, to your point around terminations being all over the place, this is seasonally disrupted by holds. And so you'll see kind of end of quarter or beginning of quarter tanks where there's drops, and it's because we're seeing some push for summer programming, and then it wrapping up, going into fall programming, and then it wrapping up in really different levels of when there's been outreach or any retention efforts.
Yeah, I think I when I saw those two like dips, I was thinking like, what happened around that time of year? But like you said, also holds just had such a great play in that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look for October, because that was over the year. October, let's dig in. We, like I mentioned, holds, name of the game, so high compared to last year. But the other numbers have been consistent month over month as far as the breakout by revenue type. Are there any major takeaways that you see here?
Yes. So there are some consistent, if you look at the two right columns, they're moving in not quite, I mean, they are moving in, you would think they would move in opposite directions, right? But they're not, meaning at the top of the holds, you would think that for instance, that may correlate and move in the complete opposite direction of terminations. And it kind of levels out in the middle. And this is what we were saying from an on average, if you have very large hold percentages, how does that impact your terminations, or does it impact your terminations? And so I actually think that what this says compared to last year is, honestly, I'm glad this is after the seasonal behavior where we were looking at it as a whole, because throughout the year, everything I've just said evens out. It's affected. You kind of see the relationship between holds and terminations, and where there is one and isn't one. For October specifically, what this says to me is some disrupted seasonality. And so, and what I mean by that is, when I was talking about hold strategies for size of organization, you can see in this particular month, that's almost 1,000% year over year change in holds. That, not surprisingly, on a 1 month basis, is going to potentially lower terminations, because one of the reasons why you put on hold is to avoid billing, is to avoid termination. What I would say is that everybody's up. Look at that. Imagine if the highest one was 400, we would be talking about how large that was. So what I would say is that, yes, it is related to terminations, but on the whole of the year, we see this averaging out. So that's just what I would call out. It's very interesting how those two move together. And also, this, not surprisingly, supports what we saw when we were looking at revenue, because if you're on hold and you're avoiding billing, it's not surprising that, again, it's going to affect your active units. If you do that, so it's not surprising that the higher your active units, the higher your holds, the lower your active units. That goes hand in hand, and therefore it's also not surprising how that ended up in how that affected membership revenue earlier. Now, I will say one other piece that jumps out to me, and then I will hand it over, Chrissy, because I'd love your thoughts on this. Is, remember that favorite graph that you and I both have around facility usage, where it's the two highest ones at the top, that smaller group and the larger group. Look at the joins here. And this has been consistent in the past couple months, where we see, even though it's just comparatively higher, the two groups of organizations that consistently have the lowest number of terminations and the highest number of joins are also, not surprisingly, therefore having that higher number of usage rates. So to what extent all those things are influencing each other will be really interesting to keep. We'd have to dig into that more. Will be really interesting to see if that continues. And certainly sometimes this is on a big scale and a small scale, but I would just kind of mention that as one last thing that jumps out.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. Pretty consistently, I will say, surprisingly, over the last couple of months, new joins have been ticking up. They're not as high as last year, but they continue to tick up across the whole movement, not just for that one revenue group, but to your point, the 0 to 3 million have been the highest driver in that new joins number, which I just like, I want to hop on phones and ask people what they're doing around that, because I think it's an interesting trend that is it based off of ability to stay open? Is it based off of their pivot to virtual offerings? It's that getting into the why. We see the what is happening, but digging in a lot deeper into the why is happening, I think is just really, really great things to be thinking through.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear if we have people post about that in the live chat or in questions. If you're in one of those organizations or have spoken with them to get that, I would love to hear that.
For sure.
Yep.
Oh, we have one that said, I would guess the 0 to 3 million is more rural associations with perhaps less impact of the virus. Yep, agreed.
Yeah, and also I would say anecdotally to that point, I keep using anecdotally because I know this from conversations, and you know me with my data head on, I want to go confirm it, but we do see that sometimes the Ys and Js have been able to, again, remain a level of open, whether it's virtual or in person in those smaller organizations, and other wellness or fitness offerings have not, or have lessened, or have a different level of access that they were available to offer. That seems to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
For sure. Let's dig into registration. So first we're going to jump into programs, and then we'll go to childcare, because childcare is an interesting story. Not that programs isn't, but programs, we are at about, for October, 84% back to normal for what registrations were normally for 2019. In this graph, you see that major dip that we see on the others, because when it first happened, programs halted. But we see a pretty consistent slow trend upward. What are some takeaways here?
Yeah. So, I mean, oh my goodness, I have heard such fantastic answers to this question. This is very representative of everything our partners and our Ys and Js have been sharing that they've done since to offer first, emergency response, and then certainly like some concept of summer programming, some concept of what is now, during what would normally be fall programming or school age programming has changed. And I think you can see, we've said this word a couple of times, I keep coming back to it. You can see kind of the normal seasonality at the top there. And that is not surprising, right? Like that looks very much, if you're familiar with programming that's not childcare, this looks pretty normal. I will say childcare and campus is a different trend line, but when you look at it throughout a year, that should be what's expected. So what this says to me is just a very strong confirmation of what we know to be true about how different this is, how different non-childcare and camp programming is when you look at those things side by side. And then also it's trying, look at the end there, the seasonality here is totally broken. We did not regain this line. We regained it in other places. You saw it in terms of some membership. You saw it in terms of revenue and some other pieces, but the numbers around this have drastically shifted based on levels of openness and also how programming was re-envisioned at the time. So that's an obvious answer to your question. I feel like, again, that's something I would love. I think we've got some great information from our operations, users and associations on what they've done here. But I think to me, what stands out is, hey, let's look at this next camp and childcare, since we know that has been such a different story, but having an effect on overall programming. I see a comment that programming is very low. We absolutely have instances of that. So when we say 84% back to normal, I think we have to, like we said at the beginning of this, put that in context of not only compared to last year, but compared to childcare, compared to ability to offer, and then on trend for where it was at the beginning of the year. So you'll see we were higher in January than last year. So I think programming, one last thing I would say on this view is that more than other trends that we've seen, it was starting off in a couple places. You can even see January and February this year compared to last year was already broken and you see that in the beginning of the year.
Mhm.
So I don't have an answer for that. I think this one actually warrants some excellent conversation around the what's the best compared to what, to answer your question. But I think the headline, just to kind of cut to the chase, is it really begs the question of, um, what kind of programming was offered this year versus last year, and knowing that some similar resources and sometimes staff and space, was prioritized to do childcare and school age offerings. And you can see that in kind of our next slide.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The what type of program could vary, could impact what you're seeing versus what the overall trend is. And if this is a number that resonates with you, if you're like, yeah, we're about 84% or around that, I would love for you to chat in what your thoughts are of what programming you're doing, and we can share it with the group. So for childcare and registrations, I mean, this is probably my second favorite graph, because I think this has been the biggest story of the year, which is childcare and how you've pivoted to serve your communities, whether that be through the like regular programming or new programming. Constance, what are some of your thoughts here?
Oh my goodness. I mean, you just said, look at, if we had any other data point that was up more than 200%, I don't think anyone would stop. That would be what we talked about at NATO. That would be what we talked about, I'm trying to think about like any discussion we were having with partners, or in a whatever conference season we were in, because that would be enormous. And so we are right to be leading with an impact on operations, which is what is up front in this. And this continues to be something that we should examine. It is the only, it's the only thing other than holds and terminations, which is up to this degree in the data. It's the only thing, and it makes complete sense from a mission-driven perspective, from a meeting the needs of the community perspective, and knowing, for those of you who are in operations every day, knowing the types of programming that is set up in the camp and childcare module. This is clearly where the greatest community needs have been. And the fact that Y's and J's were able to step into that so quickly, to the point of doubling this offering. These are registrations. This is not money, right? So I want to call that out. The revenue impact of that may be different. This is usage. This is need. This is a doubling and meeting a need. And so I think the piece to note about registrations is this is truly when, and I'm not sure, I can't see the question in the chat, but this would be when a registration is logged. It may or may not be when it is offered. And so that's the one piece I would call out, is this: there may be a slight disconnect, and you can see some broken seasonality on that, where typically in the beginning of the year we see that a little May bump because we're going into summer programming, and that's when those slots open up. June is low because everybody just did it. And then obviously it goes back up. August is a spike, because I know I certainly registered my kids for this. You've got school age care. School age care is now completely re-envisioned, maybe more during the day, virtual, all the pieces, which you've heard some wonderful, just fantastic examples of meeting that need have been. But really, I mean, this is, I want to spend a lot more time other than just calling out this number, because this is understanding what was done here and how it was done. And how it impacted revenue as a result, how it impacted retention, how it impacted fundraising, which is another piece I think to take away as a question to examine in support of these, or in order just to talk about the community impact of the organization. I think is going to be very important for us to look back on as the year as a whole.
Yeah. Definitely. I think so. To Stacy's question about like a weekly rate, is it counting with this number? Is it like a one-time registration or each week?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So since we are looking at this one as a monthly view, it would end up being like your entire account. So if you had open registration in October, there was a new registration that was logged in October that wasn't there in September, and then closed out, you'd have that one distinct account. So I think I'm answering the question, but however you have that set up, to count, if it would have an October date on it, then it's going to be counted once in October. But if you have multiple sessions, I know sometimes we can open up her camp childcare sessions, like you said, you can register for a week at a time. Those would each be 2, and then that's it. Depending on how you've organized that in the system, it would count separately or together. Does that make sense? It's all about the upfront configuration choice in the count.
Yep. Sounds good. Well, let's look at a breakdown by, because this is at the holistic view, so it's like a movement at large. What does it look like on the revenue side? So we have a very similar chart to what we talked through earlier with the breakdown, which to your point of like revenue or check-ins may have been hitting a little bit more in the like large 20 million plus. They are crazy at work serving their community when it comes to childcare in camps. I mean, this graph is very interesting. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, differences in need. So look at this. So I think the other piece is that this really confirms the view of when we say we're about like 200 and 20% of year over year. You can see like obviously how that's breaking out camp and childcare. I don't want to forget to also call out an answer to your question that 80% of programs, and why if you were listening to that section saying, hey, we're still really low, like why that might be, because if you are high in camp and childcare, you are typically, and we've seen this throughout the year, lower. It has moved consistently to be lower in program registrations. And remember, those two things are separate. You could both, they're not competing with each other, right? They may be competing in terms of resources or staffing from an operational perspective, but it would technically be possible for them to move together. And so I think what we're seeing is both ability to engage the community for some of those smaller, and I think someone brought this up earlier, rural areas. We absolutely have childcare needs. So one big takeaway is if those were, let's say this wasn't 2020, 159% increase is still huge. That's enormous. So there's still a need there. But if you can see like why compared to their programming, they are higher, I think that would be really interesting to compare what types of programming is being registered for in those areas. Is it more senior programming? Is it food? Is it like making meals available to families or school age childcare, which is sometimes put in that area as opposed to childcare? Are there other emergency response needs that just look different in those that are ending up in that area? But yes, I think I'm going to say something that, again, I've said a couple of times, I'll keep doing it because I want to acknowledge the experts that are listening to this beyond you and me, is that the larger organizations you are, the more urban area that you're in comparatively, that need and then meeting it, look at that, that's 347% over normal is impressive, not only in a number, but in terms of ability to do it. So if you have the ability to do this, that I think is just that to me is a natural extension of some of the, I know we're saying beyond the pivot, but some of the adjustments that were made that we heard about yesterday, right? So what you can't do what you did last year. What are you going to do? What is the need? How can we meet it? What do we already do well? And how can we do that more than we ever did before? I think, again, I know we're talking numbers and I can dig into the stats around this, but just from an operational perspective, that being able to do that, let alone having it, being able to execute on that is, while you're seeing that, as we know from the very beginning, also being the highest group impacted. So you can imagine they have the biggest overhead, the biggest service area, the biggest hit to membership, the biggest hit to revenue, and more than tripling their childcare and camp offerings, which I know is probably, I think on the one hand, I'm surprised, and on the other, I'm not, having worked with WISE for a dozen years and Jay's for that long, like it absolutely from a mission perspective makes sense. But yeah, those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. I think you nailed it on the head. And I don't know if everything that Constance just said struck a chord with any of the attendees who are from an association that size. Well, we are saying all of you, but especially that group, we see you and we like validate all of your feelings of being overwhelmed because you are killing the game when it comes to serving your community.
I think, to that point, for those of you who were in the session before this, where we talked about running at the storm, like these are the experts in that. Like, I would love to hear, like, this is the answer. This is being done. It's
Yeah.
being done. So this is a standpoint of there is a need where you're going to absolutely charge to it, in the midst of not only the societal obstacles that we talked about before, but just to purposefully repeat the point that you just made. Fewer resources, fewer staff, to do it is incredible. And I would absolutely love to do a case study on a couple, one of
For sure.
that group right there.
Well, thank you guys for walking through those trends with us. I wanted to take we have about a little under 15 minutes or so to talk about, okay, we just talked through a bunch of trends that we hope you guys leverage each month when we send it out. It's on Daxko.com under Insights on the main page. And we encourage you to use that as a tool. It's meant to be a tool because we understand that, like, you guys just want insight. You guys just want some data and you want to be able to compare it. But we also have tools that you can leverage, that you already have access to, or that you could explore as well. So we're going to dig into some of those. So we put together this little chart into digging deeper into data because for many of you, operations reporting, it is what you need it to be, but you wanted to get it a level deeper. So we're going to talk through some options. Constance, do you have any thoughts on this main chart here?
Yeah, so I think the main takeaway is knowing what you need to get your hands on and knowing how to get it. That's stating the obvious, but really calling out that we're aware that there's multiple ways to access what's needed or to identify what's needed, and that there's a continuum of how sophisticated that can get. So starting from, what do you get? What's the tried and true pieces that you check every day that's in operations? And then if and as you're able to go deeper and spend more time in that, or get a deeper level of analysis, whatever that looks like for your organization, that there's kind of a continuum of access beyond what is available in the source system to kind of complement whatever else it is that you're trying to do. Particularly, we've leveraged all of these internally ourselves. I use each of these things, particularly the first three, every day, to kind of dig into the trends that we're talking about. So I know that we're all in different positions of being able to do that, having time to do that, having knowledge of how to do that. But I think the main takeaway is that identifying the right question that you want to keep track on and knowing where to find that is really represented in terms of how deep these solutions get.
For sure. So let's dig into operations reporting. So first thing, when we were putting together this presentation, I reached out to our services team and said, okay, what are the top reports that you guys get questions about all the time? Because I feel like we get that question. We've hosted sessions either at the road shows or last year's Accelerate, and they were like, well, what are your top reports? So we pulled that list together. And these were for canned and custom reports, the top most used reports in operations. So, Constance, we talked about this earlier, but like, there's a main theme here.
Yeah. It's all related to finances. This is all related to finances and usage. So at the end of the day, on a given year, and I can put this in some context, having answered that question over the years, the sales and activity report has been the most accessed report since I've been looking at this answer, Christy, which is not surprising for any operations user. It is. We've actually got some users where it's meant you like refresh, and just see those numbers changing. And if you're unfamiliar with that report, it is truly showing you your joins. It's showing you your members. Like you can just look at the people and the money going back and forth, almost like a really good comparison would be like a bank statement, right? Like you see things in and out. Absolutely not surprising that report is tried and true in that way. The rest of them, you can probably tell by their names, but this is always financial reporting. It is always high. It is higher than I've seen it. Again, just anecdotally speaking, this year for probably does not need explaining, but I think that the focus is well understood to be understanding as quickly as we can, not only what just happened. So here's the main thing I see is that not only what just happened, which we look at all the time, reconciling returns, reconciling discounts, joins, all of that stuff is part of everyday operations, but then trying to, as much as possible, understand that sooner in the financial cycle in a given month, and also use it to anticipate next month. That's always happened at some level, and that's always happened a lot at some organizations, somewhat at others. And just seeing those being leaned into, those two kind of data access points, it is absolutely I think to be expected this year, and we just see them being accessed even more than usual.
Right. Well, and so one thing that we would talk through with reporting is like this is a great way to access your data. Like in the moment you can snapshot it, but we are talking through all these trends and we've gotten a bunch of messages about how um, we're different in this way and we're different in that way, and we totally recognize like these national trends are meant to be a resource, but
Yes,
sometimes you want to be able to get a level deeper to compare.
that's right.
So I wanted to talk through performance analytics
Mhm.
because that's your baby. But it also is just such an impressive way to get that level of detail that like you we would love to be able to publish at scale, but that would be a lot to digest. So that's something that as a
Yeah.
resource that you can use to do the comparison. So I wanted to kind of open that up.
Yeah, and so for those who are haven't seen performance analytics in a while, or are just new to it, what you're seeing here is some screenshots. It's got a mobile view and a desktop view, and I think I said this at the top of it. This discussion, but I would really call it out when it's related to understanding data through this access point. So all this information only matters if you can do a really important thing. I was going to say two things. I actually would challenge myself to get down to one thing. If you can count it the way that makes sense for your association or your organization, whatever that is. So I mentioned a classic silver sneakers example. We bring that up all the time. But if you're asking me for a membership count and I can't include and exclude members or memberships the way I need to, the way my leadership or my board needs to keep track of that, I can't use that and I can't use it easily. Same thing with GLs. If we're keeping track of revenue and you're in accounting, if you want to group GLs together, you want to group certain revenue streams together, exclude others, or for whatever reason based on your reporting, you need to do that. And there's so much time spent doing that. So right now we know it's a wonderful, the answer to your question is a wonderful follow-up to the previous slide, where we were talking about best understanding kind of where the data is going and compared to what. There's a lot of time that is spent creating views for that, pulling reports for that, analyzing data for that. And so really one of the goals of performance analytics is to grow it continually into doing more and more of that work, removing those hours as much as possible, so that at a click of a button you can do those things like, let me just kick out whatever discount group for whatever reason and exclude that, or just zero in on it, and have the chart immediately done, have the KPI immediately done, and then to the point which I don't want to bury, I want to call out having another comparison for what does good look like. We keep talking about percent back to normal. There's other ways to segment data and compare it other than revenue size, and revenue size is very important. That is the most common way to do it in the movement, which is why we wanted to echo that and meet the current conversation where it was. There's other meaningful ways to compare, how back to normal we are, or what's going on in other like organizations. And that's available in this as well, where you could segment data and say, hey, that's interesting, that's great, but I want to compare my information just to another association or organization that has the same number of members I do, or that's also in an urban area, or that's also in a rural area, and having that ability to toggle your compared to what. And so at a glance, that's really the goal with this solution.
So we actually have a great demo that Constance has walked through. I'm going to post that in the resources channel later on, just so if you guys wanted to dig into what the system is and explore it for yourself, we encourage you to. And it's just like a quick 4-minute video. I'll post that afterwards, but I'll send that out as a resource. One thing, we're getting some really great feedback in the chat around reports. Anna on our team is pulling those and saving them externally, and we're going to get them to the team as well. So like, please feel free to use that as a resource. Like, we love that feedback. We welcome it. So now is the time. Not that you can't do it later, but you're welcome to do it.
No, but absolutely, please, all the feedback. We will take it. Thank you, Anna, for compiling that.
So I want to dig in to Vault. We have just a couple of minutes left, so we're going to have to
I'll
move
make it quick.
So really wanted to, I'm going to let you shine here for a minute, because Daxko Vault is something that is maybe newer, or it's not newer, but it may not be as leveraged across many associations. I want you to talk through it.
Yeah. So the quickest answer, and I will keep this brief, is that Daxko Vault is the completely organized, cleaned up, deduplicated data out of operations that's organized to do the things that you see on the screen here. So it is like, the analogy I use is, it's the difference between shopping at the front end of Target, like if you walk in and take something off the shelf, versus if you were given the data keys, so to speak, to the warehouse, and you had to go back and navigate where all the things were stored in boxes. It's the data equivalent to that. So essentially, Daxko Vault is a data warehouse. It is what is underneath performance analytics, and it's powering that. And it is in its best life. If anyone's interested in doing any of the things on the screen that you see here, if you're interested in storing your own data, outside Excel in a better, more secure way, to do that over time, combine it with other information, it is built to do that. It is built to connect directly, almost like a plug-in, for a non-technical way to put it, into a business intelligence tool like Microsoft Power BI or Tableau. It is built to handle that beautifully. And it's also built for, if you do have the ability to deeply analyze data, or even just one person on your staff who does. One of the most successful uses that we saw of Vault in the early days is, we actually had an intern from a community college at one of our Ys set up some analysis for them that they just repeated out of the warehouse. They didn't even have to write it again. It was worked with that organization for a few months, set up some formulas for them and some statistical queries for them, and just pulled it exactly the way they wanted to see it. So that's what it is very organized historical data that comes out of operations that's built to do these three things.
Awesome. We've gotten a couple of questions about re-recording some of the custom reports webinars. Completely. I will get that feedback to the services team, and we can get that up to date. But yes, I think Daxko Vault is truly getting that level deeper in the data. So it's for that person. It was traditionally made for that person that like loves to swim in the data. But if you're leveraging a tool like Power BI, it is an easy surfacing of that data for you.
That's right. So if you want to use something like Power BI, which I know a lot of Ys did and want to, again, it is the ideal data to point to it. It as you're making decisions, moving forward about how you want to get your information.
For sure. The last thing to talk through today, I'm going to own this one, is the API and the exchange. So we now have a new Daxko API that allows you to really get into the specific data point that you need and that you want to surface for your association. So if you have more questions about that, we encourage you to. But then also built on that API is our new exchange. So the exchange was launched a couple of months ago. This is our new partnership platform that really, if you were with us at General Assembly last year, was Daxko certified interface. Now it is leveraged as the exchange, because we actually have a full marketplace where you can go on to and search the different partners that have been verified. They've had to pass our security standards in order to connect to the API. And then if they have passed that security standard, they are either in some sort of phase of building out the API to connect within some of our resources. And if you go on to exchange.daxko.com, you can search through, filter down to see which of our partners are connected to operations, or if they are connected to another source based off of one of our products. But I really encourage you guys to dig in and explore that and see, because when we're talking about that continuum of access to data, sometimes that even level deeper of access to data is sharing it with another partner who's going to really help you extend your reach and expand your ability to streamline your processes. So encourage you to take a look. That's one of our newest resources. And with that, we are at time. So if you guys have other questions for us, thank you, Constance. Every time you walk through this data, I feel like I learned something new, and we even talked through it beforehand. So thank you.
Yes, I feel the same. Thank you.
So what we'll do is that we are at 10:30 or 10:31. Our next session starts at 10:45. And as a reminder, that is the Birds of a Networking session. So in breakout room 1, it's leading your team. In breakout room 2, it's streamlining your process. In breakout room 3, main room is leading your team. Breakout room 1 is streamlining your process. Marketing your mission is streamlining this your mission or marketing your mission. I'm going to post that in the live feed with the links. So hop into Cadence, jump in there and access that, and we'll have about 45 minutes of networking where you guys can just go in, like hop in and chat and get to know the people who are attending. So I encourage you guys. Thank you guys again, and we'll be sending this recording out with all the other recordings in the next couple of days.